Thank you. As Eric has said, I decided to call this talk Umbraco anno 2023 because this is what I will cover, most of what we have done, and I will extend it a little bit and talk about what happened since last Codegarden. And actually, during Codegarden last year, we released Umbraco 10. Umbraco 10 was the first long-term supported version of Umbraco that was released using the new, pretty fast but super predictable release schedule. It's built using .NET 6, which is also long-term supported by Microsoft. And this was the first version that we called true cross-platform support due to the SQLite support. But since the first release, of course, we also added features in the minor releases. In 10.1, we added a feature we call runtime modes. And this is actually a feature I'm super happy about because it's such an easy way to get a bit of better performance of your site without doing really a big effort. So we have 3 modes. We have back-office development, we have IDE development, and we have production. And the default one is the back-office development. And this is, like you know Umbraco, you can basically build a simple website directly from the back-office. But if you're not using these things, for example, if you're using a build pipeline to ship your websites, you can turn it into production, and thereby we can disable some key parts of Umbraco, like the runtime compilation of views. And when we do that, the underlying web framework can optimize a lot of things. Also in 10.2, we released another feature called language permissions. So now you can specify on a subset, or on your user groups, you can specify a subset of the languages that this user group can manipulate. We decided to allow read access because it's a common use case to draw inspiration from some of the other languages. And these permissions are respected by both content and dictionary items. In 10.4, we released a massive new property editor. It's called the block grid editor. So the idea was to cover the use cases from the grid layout, but also this super popular package called doctype grid editor. And at the same time, improve the editor experience. So when using grids, you can push some of the responsibility for the design from the developer to the editor. And this makes sense in some cases. And as the name indicates, it's built on top of the blocks that we use for the block list. And we're super happy about this feature, and we're also happy about seeing extensions from the community already. Ken will do a deep dive on Friday and really showcase the power of this new property editor and how you can make a brilliant editor experience using it. Umbraco 11 was released in December last year. It's powered by .NET 7, and .NET 7 unlocks C#11. .NET 7 is the fastest .NET ever built, and C# just becomes better and better for each version, in my opinion. And of course, we want to bring this amazing platform to you, but there is breaking changes in the .NET versions. So we can only bring them in our major versions. Besides .NET, we also updated TinyMCE. TinyMCE is the library or the framework we use for the rich text property editor. It was updated from version 4, which was end of life, to the latest version, which is 6.4. 6.4 don't have a public end-of-life date yet because how TinyMCE do their support phases are when they release a new version. The old one have 6 months of support, and that's also why we need to have this pretty fast release schedule. Otherwise, we can't keep up to date with these technologies. Another feature I'm super happy about is the maintenance page. We introduced it in 11.2. So before 11.2, when your Umbraco instance was in the upgrade state, all the website visitors would have been redirected to the back-office login page. This is not really a good user experience. So now, by default, we present this pretty neutral maintenance page, but you can style it and replace it like you know from the 404 page. But the power really comes with this feature when you disable it, because this is a possibility. If you disable it, your website visitors will just see your website, including the potential errors that the upgrade state leads to. But the truth is, often Umbraco can perfectly fine serve the website while being an upgrade state, while you as an editor and as an administrator in the back office do the upgrade. So if downtime is a concern to you, this is a feature that can really shorten the downtime. Umbraco 12 will be the next version of Umbraco. It will go out by the end of this month. We already have release candidates available, and it still runs on .NET 7 because it's the latest .NET. The main feature is the content delivery API, so this brings native headless functionality to the CMS. We have designed the specification together with the hardcore team, so the upcoming version 3 of the REST API and hardcore will have the exact same specification, so you, without friction, can move from Umbraco to hardcore. As long as you didn't change the Umbraco API, because the delivery API is built like every other feature in Umbraco with an extreme level of flexibility. But we hope the default configuration cover a lot of use cases where you have built your own headless capabilities in Umbraco, and thereby easing your upgrade path. So the API specification is an open API specification, and we have Swagger UI available as long as you are in development mode. We decided to version each endpoint individually instead of the entire API. This is mainly to let us add new or change existing parameters without breaking the old API. Then we can make a new version. So even that the first version really solves a lot of use cases, we are aware of a few missing features. These are mainly related to member authentication and the protected content. So with the 0.0 release, the protected content can't be served through the delivery API. But we plan to add this feature in some of the minor versions of Umbraco 12. So we have prepared for it and plan to do it without breaking changes. We also plan to look into features like output caching and potentially other minor performance improvements. Elitza have a talk next up on this stage, and she will really showcase the power of this new delivery API. Besides the delivery API, Umbraco 12 also comes with better support for EF Core. So now you can execute your EF Core work in the same transaction as all the Umbraco work from our services that are executed using NPogo. And thereby you are ensured that your work is rolled back together with the Umbraco work if something goes wrong. We still don't use EF Core in Umbraco ourselves, but we actually hope to do it for the member support for the delivery API. And longer term, we plan to look into all our repositories and see if we can make them perform using EF Core. MMXXIII was released in March this year, and it has a new license you need to pay attention to, but it has a transitive clause, so you're allowed to use it free of charge in Umbraco. But if you use the library yourself, pay attention to the license. That's also the reason that it's still available to you to use MMXXIII that has the Apache 2 license. But of course, if you downgrade, you will miss all the features and improvement of MMXXIII. NPogo has been updated from 5.5 to 5.7. Even that this is a minor update. It fixes a couple of bugs, but they also have a tiny breaking change. I don't expect it to be hit by it, but it's the database interface that have more methods. And in general, Umbraco 12 have updated all our dependencies to the latest versions. Also some of the less known dependencies, like MailKit we use for our mail communication and SMTP communication, like Serilog we use for logging, and even the B+tree algorithm we use to power NuCache. And Umbraco 12 is a major version, so there are breaking changes, but we have done a big effort to minimize those, and also thank you to the community to pinpoint some of the annoying breaking changes. We have been able to revert those, and we're happy to see so many packages that was built from Umbraco 11, but still runs out of box in Umbraco 12. But there's a few areas that have breaking changes. These are mainly related to the migrations. So migrations have some code-wise breaking changes related to post-migrations, but also have one big functional breaking change. Because before Umbraco 12, all migrations was executed in one big transaction, and we had to change this, so now each migration is executed in its own transaction, and thereby rolled back individually. The main reason for this have been so we can be able to support SQLite, because it have some limitations in some of the table manipulation statements that are not allowed to execute inside a transaction. But Umbraco 12 follows the trend. It is a small major release, like the last couple of releases. So this diagram shows the green bar is the commits from the major version to the major version. The blue bar is the commits from the last minor to the next major. And the orange bar is the files changed from major to major, and the yellow is the files changed from the last minor to the next major. And I think this clearly shows that the latest releases have been easier to upgrade to compared to back in the day. Maybe you will notify a small spike between 10 and 11 in the orange bar, and this was because we reformatted our entire C# code base. This is almost the same diagram, but here the green and blue bars are the insertions of code lines, and the orange and yellow are the deletions. And in this diagram, the reformatting is even more clear. This brings me to Umbraco 13. This will be our next long-term supported version of Umbraco. It will go out in the mid of December this year. It will be built on .NET 8, which is also a long-term supported version of .NET from Microsoft. And this will unlock C# 12. And there's a few features from C# 12 I want to highlight. The first one is called using directives for additional types. And when I first saw this, I was not really convinced what I should use it for. But when I realized I could combine it with the global usings from C# 12, I really saw the power. Because now I can specify somewhere in my code base, for example, user ID is an alias of a GUID. It still compiles to a GUID, so there's no breaking changes, but in my opinion, it becomes easier to read and maintain, because you can have this single type you can change if you want to make it nullable all the way through your code base. And it's funny, because it's actually one of the missing features of C# I talked with Mads Torgersen about last year, because I missed it from the days where I was a C developer. Another feature that is super simple. It's called default values for lambda expressions, and it's a pretty good name, because it's what it is. So from C# 12 and forward, you can call your lambda expressions without specifying all the parameters, and they will fall back to the default value. The last thing I want to highlight is called primary constructors for non-record classes and structs. So primary constructors was introduced a couple of C# versions ago for records, but now they're available for regular structs and classes. In my opinion, it still only makes sense for models and DTOs. I don't plan to introduce those for our services. The main reason is because Microsoft dependency injection frameworks is not using this. It is still just a greedy algorithm and using the constructor with the most parameters. But it's almost syntactical sugar. But there's one thing, and that is you need to call this. All your constructors somehow need to call the primary constructor. So the underlying framework updates gives a lot of power already, but of course we're also doing things ourselves. The first thing is a modern login screen, so we want to avoid exposing legacy technology to everybody. We plan to use the same login screen using web components as we want to do for the new backoffice. Together with .NET 6, Microsoft actually decided to move to minimal hosting model, to abstract some of the boilerplate and make the process of setting up a web host even simpler, especially for newer developers. And we, of course, want to align with best practices. So we have decided to move to the minimal hosting model, even that this will require some changes in your setup, how you set up Umbraco. So today you have a program CS and a startup CS files, and these are basically being merged. Of course, we can document how to do it if you haven't changed these. But if you have changed it, you need to look at Microsoft documentation to see how to do it. This is one of the things we have talked a lot about internally for a long time, when to introduce this. But we had the discussion with our community team and actually agreed on just rip off the Band-Aid as soon as possible. In my opinion, the biggest benefit of this is all the Microsoft documentation becomes easier to understand because they have updated all their code samples to the minimal hosting model. We also work on a feature we call lazy loaded content, and this will lead to faster boots, especially for the larger solutions. We plan to make it configurable what content to be loaded on boot, and of course make it replaceable so you can make your own load routine. We also plan to utilize Microsoft's abstractions for distributed caching and make it an optional second-level cache. We expect this to have quite an impact on large sites and load-balanced sites. And all these things also allow us to remove some of the files that today is required on the local disk and thereby become even more cloud-native. Another massive feature we plan to look into, which is super, super low level, is we want to refactor how we persist the block property data. Today, it's just persisted as one big JSON document, but we plan to persist it like regular content, because this unlocks all kind of cool features for the future. One of them is block level variations. So here the idea is you can have an invariant block list or block grid, and thereby the structure will be shared between all your languages. But you can still have variant blocks, so the content inside each will vary. And we think this will be super valuable for editors of multilingual sites. We also plan to make it easier to do webhooks. So yeah, notify other systems about the notification that happens in Umbraco. The first iteration will be without UI, but we will do some of the retries and authentication and a logging and so on. So even though Umbraco 14 will not be released this year, we are doing a lot of development for it already. As mentioned, the preview for especially package developers is already available. It will also run on .NET 8 and thereby have C#12 available. It will go out in May next year. I won't go into too many details about the new backoffice, but Umbraco 14 is the target version of the new backoffice. Jacob have a full talk about it. If you are worried about this or interested in general, go watch his talk. It will be super interesting. But now that we have to implement a new backoffice anyway, we want to avoid leaking our integer IDs to the UI. Instead, we want to use the GUIDs. One big advantage of this is when you are using tools like deploy or using, you will be able to have the same IDs on each environment and thereby ease your debugging sessions. We also plan to make a headless management API, and this will also have an open API specification. And we're actually trying to make a good management API, and not just an API that fits well for the new backoffice, because we think it's valuable in so many use cases to have a headless management API. It will be accessible through the same Swagger UI as the delivery API. We work with a pattern we call viewports. So this is to present the data for a specific entity in all kind of use cases. So this could be the tree representation, this could be the picker representation, the list view representation of all things like content or language or these things. We also decided to have explicit request and response models. This is mainly to avoid future breaking changes. So sometimes they will be completely equal, but this allows us to introduce new properties on the response without making breaking changes. We decided to use the attempt pattern that had been found in Umbraco codebase for many, many years. So this allows us to return a status together with the result from the service. The status can communicate all kind of expected errors, and thereby we can avoid exceptions. All newly introduced methods in our service layer will be async. Again, this is mainly to avoid future breaking changes because we really plan to benefit of the async. But right now, only half of them are actually true async. And we managed to move a lot of business logic to our service layer. And we're super happy about this because complex tasks becomes much easier to do programmatically in the future. I don't expect you to read this code, but it just shows a regular controller action and how little is actually back in the responsibility of the actions. because most of the logic now is in the service layer. But let's look at a real code example. So consider you want to create a user programmatically. You will go to the user service interface. You'll now have a create async method. Because it's async, it returns a task of a attempt with a user creation result and a user operation status. As input, it takes a user create model together with information about the performing user and whether the user starts approved or not. The user create model is super simple. It's only primitive types or a set of primitive types. The user creation result is the result that is returned in case of success. Have the user of the created user, and it will have the initial password that respects the password configurations. And it will have the status. So the status could be a success, but it could also be all kind of validation errors, like duplicate username, like a duplicate or an invalid email address, and all these things. So earlier, all these things was handled in our actions in the controllers, and thereby our service layer was not as useful programmatically as it will be now. We also use the opportunity to change the underlying JSON framework. So we want to replace Newtonsoft JSON with system text JSON. It has been introduced and slowly improved in the latest versions of .NET. It's built with performance and security in mind, but it comes with a small cost of the friendliness of the framework. But my experience is around 90% of the use cases is equal. But there's a few things to be aware of. I have a subset of those here. So first thing is system text JSON is case sensitive. You need to respect the casing, otherwise it won't serialize and deserialize correctly. There's also a lot of things that is not part of the original RFC of JSON that is not possible out of box anymore, like tailing commas, like JSON comments. Furthermore, there are some extreme cases that are not possible, like single quote strings. You need to use the double quote, which is part of the RFC, how to do JSON. Also, you can't pass in a non-string to a string property. You can't just say true and serialize it to, or deserialize it to a string property. It won't do the toString automatically for you anymore. So we need to follow the right way to do JSON even more, but this leads to better performance, so it's really worth it. We also plan to introduce the UI for the webhooks. So the reason we are delaying the UI is because of the new backoffice, and we don't want to rebuild the UI. But the UI will be like you know it from hardcore, so advanced users or developers directly from backoffice can set up new notification or new webhooks using the notifications in Umbraco, and you can retry and you can see a log. We have a couple of property editors that have been deprecated for a while, and those will not be re-implemented for the new backoffice. The first one is the old Media Picker. It's called Media Picker Legacy now. But luckily, there's an easy migration for these, because since the introduction of the new Media Picker, version 3, it have actually been made backward compatible. So it's just changing the type. But also the grid layout and nested content won't be re-implemented. Luckily, there exist brilliant tools out there that can help you migrate these. We also have a kind of secret feature. I call it send for approval. So it's a kind of poor man's workflow implementation. It limits some editors from being able to publish, and instead they can send an email to other editors that can then go into Umbraco and review it and publish the content. But we think the free version of Umbraco Workflow is a way better solution to this use case. So to simplify things, we don't plan to reintroduce this when new backoffice is made. This brings me to the version overview. So Umbraco 7 is end of life in September this year. Umbraco 8 will go into security phase in February next year and have 12 months of security fixes. Umbraco 9 is already end of life, but luckily it's super easy to upgrade to the latest versions. Umbraco 10 is long-term supported. It will go into security phase in June next year and have 12 months of security fixes. Umbraco 11 is standard supported, so it will go into security phase in September and have 3 months of security fixes. 12 go out by the end of this month have 6 months of active development, 3 months of bug fixes, and 3 months of security fixes. And then 13, long-term supported again, go out December this year, have 6 months of active development, 18 months for bug fixes, and 12 months for security fixes. And finally, Umbraco 14, standard support again, 6 months of active development, 3 months, and 3 months of security. So besides all the features, we have also started collecting telemetry insights. I hope you know, but it has been for a couple of years now. Since 9.5, it has been possible to opt in to share even more detailed telemetry with us. Thereby, we have a better understanding of how Umbraco is used out there, and let us make better decisions. And we had a blog post a couple of months ago showcasing some of the results, and we asked for more people to opt in, and we had a lot of more responses, which is super good. So some of the numbers have also changed, which is brilliant. But again, if you can share these details, we would love to have them, because it makes our decisions better. Before I show any data, I want to set some expectations, because there are some limitations about this. So we only have data from the latest versions of 8 in general, and we don't have a bulletproof way to determine whether a site is in production or in development or staging and testing and so on. We use the ASP environment to determine if it's production. We decide maybe it's production. And the data I will present here is the last report for each solution this year. So if you turned off the detailed telemetry back in February, this will be the last one that is still counting here. The first insight is the hosting environment. So on the left, we have the total reports, and on the right, we have those that we have determined as production. It looks like 12% is actually hosting on Linux. No one is hosting on Mac. It's kind of expected. But during development, we see Mac is actually bigger than Linux. I would also call that expected. But Windows is still by far the biggest hosting environment for Umbraco. Another interesting insight is the runtime modes introduced in 10.1 is not actually used that much. We see 95% is still using the backoffice development. Again, I can only recommend you to use production if you use, or if you do not use the functionality about changing templates or doc types from backoffice in your production environment. It's an easy way to get better performance. So this insight shows around 25% production sites are using those property editors that is deprecated. Please note that they're not necessarily deprecated in the versions you're using, but they are deprecated in the latest versions of Umbraco. If we look at the total number, it's a bit smaller. Maybe, hopefully, this indicates that new sites under development is not using these property editors. The last insight is the uptake of the block grid or the block list. So surprisingly, to me at least, it looks like 44% is actually using either the block list or the block grid already. But we didn't only have focus on features and technology updates. We actually also used the last couple of years to improve our test suites, so we had a lot of focus on test. We have introduced automated end-to-end tests, so we can test all the way from the browser to the database and back. Since last Codegarden, we have replaced the Cypress framework with Playwright. Playwright is built by Microsoft, so it fits perfectly into our stack. But the main reason is actually to avoid some of the limitations of Cypress. So some of the advanced use cases, like signing in using external login providers, couldn't be tested using Cypress, but we can do that with Playwright. If you're interested in getting started with end-to-end test yourself, go watch Nikolai's talk. It's tomorrow. He will show you how to get started using Playwright. As part of our open source offering, we have a couple of small NPM packages with test helpers for Playwright, so we can help you call our APIs, creating data without the UI, and we have some selectors for the current back office, so you can just say, give me a section or whatever, instead of finding the actual CSS selector. And we keep updating these, and we plan to update the test helper libraries to use the management API and all these things, so it's easier for you. So this diagram shows the number of end-to-end tests. So we introduced it together with Umbraco 9. Because Umbraco 9 was purely a technology update, we should have feature parity. So it was an excellent use case for introducing these tests and execute on both UIs. Since then, we have added tests for some of the more complex scenarios in Umbraco, like testing out the block grid and the block list. And as of Umbraco 12, we have more than 200 use cases tested automatically, all the way from the browser to the database and back. And we are having around 40% coverage of our C# code base. Sadly, I don't have numbers of the JavaScript part yet, but we know most of the JavaScript is also called here. Besides the end-to-end tests, we also have started working on automated performance tests. We decided to go with Asia load testing. This has been generally available since February this year. But it uses the plain old JMeter scripts that have been around for, I don't know, 15 years or something. What we have currently can compare 4 sites of Umbraco, but they need to be at least Umbraco 9. We currently only have a small site under test. We use the clean starter kit. Of course, we are looking into finding a better, bigger site to do the load testing on. But it needs to be the exact similar content and hosting environment to make a fair comparison. So we ensure we test apples against apples or compare apples. We're also looking at how we can disable the background jobs while doing these tests, because otherwise a background job that is running during heavily load can influence the results. So even that this is super, super unscientific, I want to present some data. So here I test 9, 10, 11, and 12 with the versions that is compatible with the clean starter kit. We have 100 virtual users, and we use 2.5 minutes to ramp up. Of course, this diagram is super equal, just to show the test is fair. Doing this and doing the heavy load, we saw a single response from Umbraco 10 with an error status code. If we look at the CPU comparison, it's almost identical, even that the lines is not following each other. I'm sure if we rerun the test with the exact same setup, it could be a different order. So this is during the ramp-up period. If we look at the memory usage, it's also almost the same. Maybe we will see a bigger difference with a bigger website under test. But this is actually where we expect the lazy-loaded content to could minimize the memory usage. If we look at the response times, surprisingly, to me at least, 9 was actually the fastest with the response, around 10% faster. But there is a good reason, and that's the request per second. So Umbraco 9 also handled the fewest requests. Umbraco 12 can handle, in this setup, around 452 requests per second, and that is around 10% more than Umbraco 9. But the good thing is all the versions is actually performing super, super good. And one of the cool things about this new automated tests is we tried to execute it on a super, super small machine, so the CPU reached 100%. In the release candidate 2 of Umbraco 12, we actually saw some spikes. This was due to how we implemented our image sharp-free implementation. But because we had these tests, we have solved it now. And to be honest, we have most likely, we didn't have found it 2 years ago. It would have been you discovering some spikes sometime. So it's really, really cool. And as I said, we're really happy about all the versions are performing well. That was what I had prepared. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good understanding.